Okay, so let me just start off by saying there is probably no one in the MCU that has had as major of a fall from grace as Thor. At the start, we saw him as this interesting side character to the two main Avengers, and then Thor Ragnarok and Infinity War came along, and instantly he became a fan favorite. And then Love and Thunder happened, and almost everybody just wants Marvel to write him off, either by death or retirement. So, how did this happen? Because I genuinely remember being excited for Love and Thunder, and I don't think I was alone in that. And yet, as the months have gone by, you can just feel the disdain for the movie grow. And now Thor is in this weird place where you just don't care about anything he is going to be doing in the future. So, let's take a deeper look at some of the biggest problems with Thor in the MCU. And let's start off by looking at the core elements of Thor and really understanding why people love his stories so much. For starters, let's talk about Thor's dynamic with humanity. Thor is someone who has seen the wonderful side of humanity, their camaraderie, their willingness to put themselves in danger to protect the ones they love and care for, even though they are incredibly fragile. And having this experience of pure affection, of being exposed to the positive side of humanity, and by being around people who just accept him with open arms, Thor starts feeling this camaraderie with humanity. Something that he has never felt on Asgard because Odin was always very tough on him. So, Thor constantly hangs out with humans and even starts enjoying the adventures he goes on with the Avengers. So, in many ways, Earth just becomes a second home for Thor. And he starts considering himself as a god who needs to protect humanity and keep them safe. And when he has hung out on Earth so many times, he also gets exposed to the bad sides of humanity, their greed, their selfishness, their refusal to help others because they consider them the other. And he encounters people with a lot of power who are never really trying to help the fellow people who really need it, and the sheer amount of destructive tendencies they are capable of when they are in the pursuit of greed and power. And this further makes Thor want to help humanity and lead them to be better, to always bring out the positive side. And this, by the way, is one of the biggest reasons why Roxxon Corporation and its CEO are the biggest villains that Thor has in comics. They just embody the worst of humanity. Anyway, um, moving on, the second core aspect of him, this is one reason why Thor alienated me personally. It's why I never actively sought to read Thor comics. It's how much the Thor mythos leans into the Shakespearean dramatics and the gratuitous tone it comes with. And personally, I like fast paced, banterful dialogues like the ones from an Edgar Wright movie, for example. Instead of the whole, oh, my heart bears a heavy wound today, and for thou my soul cries out in denial, thee has sinned dearly. This kind of dialogue is not for me. Although I do love the insults that Shakespeare writes. Thou sodden witted lord, thou hast no brain than I have in my elbows. It's just funny to read, and Thor comics don't have that much fun with the language or the rhythm that Shakespeare plays have with their dialogue. So it's just not as fun. But there are plenty of people who do love the tragedies, the historic plays from Shakespeare, which really lean into the inner drama in a very theatrical way. And Thor comics really do that, which some people definitely do like. And the positive side of this is that it makes Thor and his stories more distinct than most of the other characters in Marvel movies. Which brings us to the third point. And look, I said I don't really enjoy the Shakespearean tones of Thor, but there is one huge reason why I started to read and to this day stick with Thor comics. And it's because Thor comics have some of the most epic battles and displays of power that you have ever seen. The sheer scale of the fights just get you glued to the page, and the power up scenes, no matter how formulaic they are, just boost my adrenaline more often than not to an unhealthy degree. It's like Goku going Super Saiyan for the first time. It just evokes something in you, and you remember how powerful that visual was, right? Well, that's the feeling you get when Thor has a power up sequence or just does something amazing. And the best story that showcases this, in my opinion, is Jason Aaron's God of Thunder storyline, where Gore has basically created a god bomb that is capable of wiping out all the gods across every reality. And he sets it off, and Thor is the only god who is trying to fight against it. So he grabs two of his hammers and tries to create a counterblast against it. And in that one moment, every god across time and space prays to Thor. And he single handedly just tanks the god bomb. And then you get this incredible visual of Thor standing with two of his hammers and the necro sword bonded to him. And he just looks grizzled and wounded, but still so powerful. And goddamn, this moment is incredible. And these are the moments that make you want to continue to read or watch Thor stories. These are the moments every writer and artist strives to capture in their runs on Thor. Which brings me to the final part, and this is just simple. The Thor comics lean into the fantasy genre that has, or at least has the potential for very good world building. Look, the world building in Thor comics is not ideal because of the nature of comics. Having multiple writers come in and tell their own unique stories, and these writers getting to pick and choose whether they want to keep something or not, and multiple writers introducing multiple new concepts into the Thor mythos that frankly makes them seem incredibly wonky. For example, continuously during Walt Simonson's run, he explicitly shows us with a flashback that Odin had two brothers whom he lost when they first met Surtur. And at this point, those were the only two brothers Odin had. And then Fear itself came along, and we get introduced to Kulboson, the god of fear, and he is stated to be the elder brother of Odin, who we have never seen and has never been hinted at. He was clearly just retconned into the Thor mythos. So, yes, comics do not have a great continuity in terms of world building, but also just having most of the writers already creating so many new elements to play with could have also made the live action version of Thor and his world so much more immersive, especially considering just how many things are within this world. You obviously have the nine realms, each of them with their own distinct aesthetic, or at least most of them have their own unique aesthetics. Jotunheim, Svartalheim, and Niflheim are very similar aesthetically. They are all realms that are filled with ice and have a dark, depressing blue hue as their signature color. So I kind of don't blame the MCU for not going there. But we also have the realm of Karnilla, which is the non realm. And we also have the whole thing about the non stones and the non witches. And we also have the history of Odin and Asgard as a whole, and how it has either forged uneasy alliances or made scorn enemies out of the other realms, which is just interesting to watch. Walt Simonson's run just shows Odin interacting with a dwarf smith, and you can just see an uneasy alliance between them because of something Odin did in the past. And these hints of events that have already occurred makes the whole Thor mythos that much more immersive. Oh, and Asgard has a societal expectation of being a brave warrior, so if somebody loses in a fight, they will most likely be publicly shamed. And it's just so ingrained in them that if somebody loses a trial by combat, it's a huge source of shame and disgrace for them. And then there are forbidden rituals and practices in Asgard. For example, summoning the dead to the land of the living and talking to them is absolutely forbidden. And Thor still does it. And this combination of showing us one world and showing how much depth it has, and then hinting that there are eight other realms which also have different species with different aesthetics, and hinting at what kind of culture and societal norms they have, will just make the world building of Thor feel that much more rich and immersive. And of course, you also have mythical creatures like dragons, Pegasus, golems, elves, witches, magical artifacts, just magic existing in general. And then later on, writers like Dan Jurgens introduced dark gods, and you have things like the Sky Fathers and the other pantheons of gods from different cultures existing at the same place. You also have celestials and elder gods that are connected to the Thor mythos. Then you later find out that there is a 10th realm called Heaven that Odin banished to another dimension. And now there are 10 realms. And you also have trolls who are cave dwellers because they don't really have any home among the 9 realms. So they just find places within those 9 realms where they can find shelter and just stay there. So you have an incredibly rich world in the Thor comics, and a constant notion that you get in Thor comics is that anything is possible, anything can show up. In fact, you could create a whole cinematic universe with just the Thor mythos alone. And in many ways, from the fantasy world to the Shakespearean ish way of speaking and the medieval aesthetic you have in Thor comics, it's not too far from the Lord of the Rings, at least on the surface. And you know how amazing the world of the Lord of the Rings is, and just how fantastical and all encompassing the stories are. So, in my opinion, these are the 4 core elements of Thor and his stories. And to Marvel's credit, they definitely did nail most of these aspects of his character, at least during his initial introduction. When he first shows up on Earth, he does act like someone who is far beyond the realm of Midgard, and when he is on Earth hanging out with Jane Foster, and later on when he hangs out with the Avengers, they really showcase the camaraderie he experiences with these people and why Earth just means so much to him. Now, they do not showcase the grand big scale battles and spectacles, but we at least somewhat get a hint of other realms and strange creatures existing. So, some props to the MCU for that. But also, most of the world building is done solely through exposition and is done on a need to know basis. The first time we see anything Asgardian related in the first Thor movie, it's an exposition dump about frost giants and Jotunheim because that's what's crucial to this movie. Then, in his second movie, there's a flashback to Dark Elves because they're important to that story. The third one has Surtur's introduction, and you guessed it, exposition dump because he is important to that story, and so on. And you see the problem with this, right? Every single part of the lore of Thor is on a need to know basis, and if we need to use it, then we will introduce it. And the problem with this kind of fast and loose explanation is that it makes the world feel so much more shallow, like this world has no depth. And let's be honest, the prophecy of Ragnarok, just based on how major it is, should have been hinted towards in some way in the previous movies, at least. But no, we have Surtur exposition dumping it upon us because that is what the story we are telling needs. And this just makes it clear that you have put no real thought into the fantasy world that you're showing us because you haven't thought past the initial premise and the current story that is happening right now. And normally I would give some examples on how to build an immersive world, but this video from the closer look exists and really shows you how a movie can show depth and immerse you in its world. It honestly explains world building way better than I ever could. So I'll just take the L and move on to some of the other major problems that Thor has. And the biggest one for me is just how ignorant the MCU is when it comes to Thor, until Ragnarok and Infinity War. And one of the biggest proofs of this is Thor's dynamic with humanity. Like I said, one of the core aspects of Thor is his main dynamic with humanity, which the MCU does establish, but also they do nothing to further explore it. And one of the great examples I can give of how much the MCU further explored a crucial aspect of the character is Captain America in The Winter Soldier. So, one of, if not the core aspect of Captain America's character is his uncompromising morality. He will always do the right thing, no matter what the circumstances are. That's just who he is. And in the Winter Soldier, they put him in SHIELD, an organization notorious for having compromising morals for the greater good. And also, they've been taken over by Hydra. And they also have him going against his best friend, who's been brainwashed to be an assassin. And in fact, in the movie, it's stated that he tried to assassinate Black Widow. And at this point, he's also rebuffed Nick Fury from existing. So he clearly needs to be stopped, and the one way to stop somebody this dangerous is by fighting to slay him. And the only way to stop Hydra from committing mass genocide is by blowing up the helicarriers, which is Fury's plan. And it's the best chance they have because it's just the five of them against hundreds, maybe thousands of SHIELD agents locked in the most secure and armed headquarters on the planet. But again, Captain America refuses to compromise on his morals, even in a perilous situation as dire as this one. Instead, he doubles down on his morals and he takes a chance on SHIELD agents, requesting a group of people working for a very shady organization to do the right thing, wholeheartedly believing that they will. And they do stand up for what's right. Then he finds Bucky, and even though rebuffing him from existence would be a lot easier, let's be honest, ethically speaking, you can't really value the life of one person over 200,000. But still, he refuses to compromise on his morals, and in the end, he brings Bucky back from being this cold blooded assassin and eventually makes him a good guy again. That's how you explore the core aspect of a character. And for Thor, well, Dan Jurgens does a brilliant job showcasing his dynamic with humanity. So, a little bit of groundwork here. Thor has been bound to a random mortal called Jake Olsen. And it's very much implied that Olsen is the part of Thor that helps him connect with and understand humanity. And during this run, Odin dies. But before he dies, he separates Thor from Jake Olsen. So now Thor is slowly losing his touch with humanity. And he is also the ruler of Asgard. You just see him slowly becoming a more cold and wrathful god. He is freeing a country from a dictator without any regard for international jurisdictions that the world, including the superheroes, operate on. You see him building the Church of Thor, where people can worship him, and you just see people starting to push back against him. He makes Loki the head of security, he marries the Enchantress, and slowly becomes more tyrannical. He eventually fights his fellow Avengers because even they start seeing Thor as a threat, and he also annihilates Jake Olsen, which permanently severs his connection to humanity. And then he just becomes this wrathful god that everybody fears, and this story gets resolved by time travel. But this story really emphasizes how important humanity and just being among them is to Thor and gods in general. And this whole story is about how Thor, in an attempt to become a better ruler for Asgard and a better god, the one who will help humanity be the best version of themselves, in an attempt to chase these quests, he ends up losing his touch with humanity. And that is the biggest reason he fails as a god. And again, this run really emphasizes how important being in touch with humanity is to gods. And it really showcases why Thor usually is the best of all the gods, because he is constantly among us, instead of just observing them from a different realm or a different part of the universe. And this run again does a great job showing you why normally Thor is the best of the gods, something which Jason Aaron further capitalizes on in his God Butcher story. And let's throw in another example of Thor's dynamic with humanity in here. This one is from Walt Simonson's run. So in this run, Odin gets trapped along with Surtur in some unreachable place. So Thor at this point is really mournful, and he ends up in this ice house with his great grandfather, and again just starts expressing how mournful he is about the fact that he can't find his father and might have lost him forever. And Buri reminds him that mortals also experience loss and do so far more frequently than us gods. And Thor immediately lashes out, saying, "What do mortals know about the burden of gods?" And this does two things. One, it just makes him relatable because let's be honest, whenever we are experiencing a lot of pain, in many ways we want it to be validated. We want to know that what we are experiencing is horrible and very wrong. But when someone reminds us that other people go through this kind of pain or maybe even experience worse kinds of pain, we immediately get defensive because we feel they are invalidating our pain by pointing out what someone else is going through. So, Thor just having a similar reaction makes him very relatable, which, based on the fact that he is a literal god with unbridled might and is the prince of Asgard, that relatability is very necessary. But more importantly, it also highlights the fact that in some ways he is jealous of humanity because he sees us as people who are protected, people whose safety is constantly being looked after, either by him or by the Avengers or someone else. We are people who are constantly being looked after while he bears so much burden, more than we could possibly know of. So, this makes him envious of us. And some issues later, Thor returns to Earth and he ends up amongst a group of homeless people and they ask him for some change, which Thor politely declines, telling them that he doesn't have any. And then the homeless people start chastising him. They tell him about how he doesn't care about them and all he does is beat up the bad guys and leave while they suffer. And Thor again lashes out at them, telling them about how they don't know what he goes through. Then he teams up with Betrayable and the Power Pack, who are a group of literal children, to fight Curse, one of his enemies. And gradually they realize that Curse is only a pawn, being used for someone else's amusement. And when they find that out, Katie, the youngest member of Power Pack, a 5-year-old, stands up for Curse. She is in tears about how Curse, someone she doesn't even know, is getting treated. And then the rest of the Power Pack just sit with her and comfort her while she is going through all of this. And just looking at this camaraderie once again reminds Thor why he loves humanity and why he chooses to protect them and leaves Midgard in a much better mood. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because Thor never really gets this treatment in the MCU. They barely even explore this with Jane. And as for the Avengers, it's surface level conflict at best. He disagrees with Iron Man, goes to take a bath, comes back saying Iron Man was right because he saw a vision. Not because there was a gradual realization of how Tony had a point and actually starts seeing things a little differently. None of that. And also, in many ways, he is reduced to the heavy of the Avengers. We never really see his dynamic with humanity fully explored, not to the degree it has been in the comics. And again, the world of Thor constantly feels like a self contained story with each movie, which, for a character like Thor, who is a powerhouse and is in a world that has this long history and has connected itself to 8 other worlds, and even in movies, it's constantly being teased that he has seen things far beyond what the people of Earth have seen. With all these parts, in many ways, Thor works best when he is used in a big scale epic story. And there's definitely a lot of restraint the MCU is showing in not going as deep into the Thor mythos as they can. And there's a very valid reason for that. Two valid reasons. One, Thor is just a tricky character because the most exciting part about him is the fantasy and the epic battles, maybe even some space adventures. But you also really need him on Earth because that is where most of the important development for his character takes place. And unlike the comics, which have multiple issues spanning multiple story arcs where they can just take their time and have Thor be both on Earth as well as really lean into the fantasy and the spacefaring adventures, in a movie there's only so much time you can get. And because the MCU was just so laser focused on the Infinity Saga and everything building to that, they just straight up did not prioritize anything else apart from that. hence why most of Thor's mythos and his character in general feels so underutilized. And the second reason is because leaning into Thor and all that he offers will inherently make him a very niche character. And because the MCU is always trying to have as much of a broad appeal as possible with each movie they release, and also want to keep the continuity of the series, that is the Infinity Saga, as accessible and understandable to the casuals as possible, they just straight up did not lean into everything about the character and the complex lore surrounding him because it might be too much information for the casuals to properly get into. Oh, and also, not a lot of people like the Shakespearean way of speaking anyway. So let's get rid of that as well. It's just a very understandable reason as to why Disney and the MCU did not want to lean into the Thor mythos as much as they could have. So we just get a scene or two where Thor is actually in Muspelheim or Vanaheim instead of really delving into each of these realms, because that way we can make Thor and his movies incredibly accessible to everybody without hitting them over the head and overwhelming them with all this lore. So there's a very good reason why we never really get a proper Thor in the movies. Except we kind of did. So let's talk about Ragnarok and Infinity War. And this is the best we have ever seen Thor on screen. You kind of get some level of backstory with Hela and how her and Odin conquered the Nine Realms, bathing in the blood of their enemies, which actually makes Asgard have a little bit more depth. You at least get to see a story spanning across multiple worlds, even though most of the conflict is isolated on Asgard. But at least the stakes involve all of the Nine Realms, even though we barely see them. But at least it's big in terms of stakes. And you also get to see this amazing power up scene where Thor finally realizes that he is the god of thunder, and he just starts descending down on this army of the dead, and you just see him absolutely mopping the floor with these guys. And in Infinity War, we finally get to see Thor actually having a motivation and go on a quest in an Avengers film. And again, he is allowed to be this powerhouse of a god and immediately just turns the tide of the battle in Wakanda the second he shows up. We actually get some world building expansion of how he got his hammer, and this is the closest we have gotten to comics Thor in the MCU, and it was amazing. He was legitimately a fan favorite at this point. But there is still one problem these two movies have, which I will be talking about in a second. But first, let's address Fat Thor, because we have reached Endgame and people don't like this version of Thor and how much he gets treated like a joke. But I love him. Having Thor just slumbering around because he has failed, because he has let everybody down, everybody who put their faith in him, who made him king of Asgard, and just seeing the enormous amount of guilt he feels about his failure is a really interesting place to take the God of Thunder, because he has never had to cope with anything like this before. He has never had to face failure in spite of all the power he has. And yes, there are a lot of jokes about him, but these jokes never take away from the severity or the sincereness that they showcase every time he is trying to do something that's actually helpful.
Why did you ask then? As guardians down there, how much my help is worth?
Stop it! Just let me. Just let me do it. Just let me do something good, something right.
And the slow, gradual discovery of his worth would have been a great arc, but towards the end of Endgame, he forfeits his throne to Valkyrie and leaves with the Guardians of the Galaxy, which is something I am not on board with. I would have preferred to see him trying to rediscover his confidence and gradually become a great king of Asgard, especially because we all know how his alliance with the Guardians turned out. Which brings us to the final problem, and I want to talk about identity stripping, which is just taking everything unique about a character and just gradually removing it from them, thus making them not as special as they used to be. And that happens very frequently with Thor because at first Marvel just gets rid of his Shakespearean way of speaking, which I was on board with, but then they just take away his big dramatic moments after his second movie and start making him a little more lighthearted. Fair enough. Then they take away Asgard without exploring even a fraction of what it has to offer. And after Asgard gets destroyed, Thor basically gets disconnected from the Nine Realms. He's just bound to Earth now. He loses Loki, and all the other interesting Asgardians are also rebuffed from existing, and he is no longer the king of Asgard, which just stripping this much out of him just makes him lose so much of his luster and his uniqueness. And after all this, now there is only one part of the character that's still remaining. He is the god of thunder. And surely they can lean into that part of his character, right? Surely they can properly explore it, right, guys? Nothing can go wrong here, right? Okay, so let me try and be as level headed as I possibly can be. So, remember how I said Thor is the greatest of all the gods because he actually spends time with humanity and cares for the mortals who really need his help and is someone who tries his best to be good? Well, in the opening sequence of this movie, he tries to help a group of people get back their temple from these roosters. He ends up accidentally destroying this temple because he's just so incompetent and has no regard for anything else apart from his hijinks fun times. And just like that, the entire reason Thor is the best among all the gods is just gone because we really needed this joke. See, people talk about how Endgame treated Thor like a joke and never really treated his problems properly. Well, this is what a joke at a character's expense really looks like. They don't even show him helping these people rebuild the damn thing. He just pisses off. He causes a lot of destruction which somebody else has to deal with and just pisses off. And throughout this whole movie, nothing is taken seriously. We have moments like this.
Let's go.
But it's why I keep everyone at arm's length.
Come on, Korg, past those nuts.
In a movie containing Go the God Butcher, the most vengefully driven dude who's literally going on a spree annihilating any god he comes across because he hates them that much. He is so consumed by vengeance for what he has lost in the name of faith to these spoiled gods who have no regard for anything or anyone that he is just going around destroying gods across the entire universe. And also Jane Foster has cancer. And this is the tone you chose for this movie. And yes, this movie also falls into the hand-wavy explanation of things just happening. Oh, here's Valkyrie casually explaining about how eternity exists locked in the center of the universe and how it will grant the wish of whoever finds it first. And here's Thor casually giving his power to all these kids. And here's a Pegasus that can open a portal and take you anywhere. Again, it's just half-assed hand-wavy explanations that makes the whole world feel so cheap. And towards the end of this whole movie, Thor is a father now. So we've either ran through or not even bothered to explore some of the major aspects of his character that make him stand out amongst everybody else. Let's see, he was the Prince of Asgard, who is gradually becoming a relatively great god, thanks to being on Earth. So the story about him going from an asshole to actually being a great king, yeah, that's gone. We abandoned it. The Nine Realms and all their possibilities, Yeah, let's just cut Thor off from there. And instead, let's put him on Earth, in Asgardia, which doesn't even come across as a place occupied by gods. No, it's just like a very special and different place that you can have as a tourist destination, like you would for Kyoto, Japan or Egypt. And let's have one elf show up on a random episode of She-Hulk, because why bother properly building out a world? And finally, let's also just screw up the god aspect of his character by making everything a parody and a complete joke that nobody can ever take seriously. And let's waste one of the best villains Thor has ever had in his 60 plus year run in comics. Because why not? Like, Thor is one of the hardest characters to write for, even in comics. You don't really have that many great runs on Thor. So you don't need to take the handful of good runs you have on him and ruin them too. Oh god. So anyway, we have simultaneously exhausted all the unique things that Thor brings to the table, but also at the same time criminally underutilized most of them. And now here we are, where Thor is a father and is clearly at the twilight of his life. He just looks content, just cooking up meals and parenting around this kid, and they have exhausted every single avenue they had for him. So at this point, no wonder people just want him to be taken off board. There is nothing he has to offer. At best, a reunion with Loki and a sacrifice that will at least be emotional and a nice send off. That's all he has to offer. So yeah, there you go. The character of Thor. How he went from being the underutilized gem to the fan favorite to someone people just want to see die, or at least have a send off to. With that being said, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to drop a like, and if you're a fan of the content that I'm putting out, make sure to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a fantastic day. Goodbye.